A good day, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm not going to expend much time introducing Nir Eyal because his reputation precedes him. And the theme of his most recent book, Being Indistractable, is one that interests all of us in this room very deeply. And we're here to ask him just that. How do you acquire this superpower? And by the time we wrap this masterclass up, we will learn from him why do we get distracted and what can we do about it. And to ensure we stay on track after this hour long session is done with, I will email all of you an 80-page workbook that New has crafted. It is intended to help implement the lessons that emerge from the session and on reading his book. Before we engage with Nir, though, I think it may be a good idea to first provide Nir an overview of what is distracting all of us who are logged onto this call. That is why, by way of pre work, we had asked everyone who logs in to complete a sentence. I am distracted by. Now, basis the responses that came in, we created a word cloud out of it. Anmol, can you display the outcome of that word cloud on the screen, please? There you go. Can you see it?
Yep.
Near now, I would imagine this word cloud provides some clues to what is top of mind for everyone in this room. What do you make of it? What occurs to you as you look at this cloud? How do the concerns of the people in this room fit in with what you've seen in other parts of the world, basis your research?
Yeah, no surprises here. I mean, this is exactly what most people complain about when it comes to what they find distracting. You know, social media, emails, phones, colleagues, messages. You know, very clear that many things can distract us. I think what's interesting to note here is that it's not just the technology that distracts us. There are all sorts of things that can distract us, like our workplace colleagues. It turns out in surveys of what distracts people most frequently in the workplace, it's actually not their technology. It's other people, someone stopping by your desk and saying, hey, can I just talk to you for a quick sec? Or did you hear about this bit of office gossip, or whatever the case might be? So there are lots and lots of forms of distraction, and it behooves us to figure out how to put these distractions in their place. That we don't want to stop using these tools altogether. We love social media. We love these tools. They help us do our jobs. We, of course, can't get rid of our colleagues, but we can learn to use these technologies so that to make sure that they don't continually distract us.
So, when I look at this word cloud very closely, Neer, I think I can hear some voices in this cloud that I can sympathize with, but they aren't amplified enough. It says distracted by urge and food, and I think I know what that means. I'm one of those kinds who are distracted by junk food and give up on exercise, and I would imagine this is a common problem, getting distracted from what we start out with. And I believe this is a personal narrative for you as well. Would you want to take us through your narrative and offer us what learnings does it take to stay undistracted?
Sure. So the idea behind becoming indistractable is to be the kind of person who lives with personal integrity. A big reason why I wrote this book was that I wrote it. I wrote this book for me more than anyone else. I was struggling with distraction in my own life, and it felt horrible that I was lying to myself. Right. That I wouldn't dream of lying to my family, to my friends, to my kids, and yet I was lying to myself every day. I would say I would go exercise, and I didn't. I would say I would eat right, but I wouldn't. I would say I would get to work on that task I've been procrastinating on, and yet I'd delay for yet another day. And so that got very tiresome. And so I thought to myself, if I could have any superpower, if I wanted a skill, it would be this power to be indistractable. Because I think in this day and age, it used to be that we could complain about not knowing what to do, right? That we could say, well, I just don't know. But today, who doesn't have access to Google? Who can? We all can look it up. And frankly, we all know what to do. Who doesn't know how to basically lose weight? You have to eat healthfully and exercise more. Is that rocket science? Do we need an expert to tell us that? Who doesn't know that if you want to have better relationships with the people in your life, you have to be fully present with them? Who doesn't know that if you want to be better at your job?
I'm sorry to butt in there, Nir, but is it true that you were obese at some point in time?
I was, yes. I did used to be clinically obese, and I still have to watch everything I eat because I do have a tendency to gain weight if I'm not careful. Okay. And so it was actually, I think, because of that earlier life experience of feeling out of control based on what I was eating. It's very analogous to what I went through in terms of technology distraction. That came a point in my life when I felt like food was controlling me, and there was a point in my life where I felt like technology was controlling me. And I did, when I went on my diets back when I was clinically obese, I would go through these 30-day programs. You know, the 30-day don't eat junk food for 30 days, don't eat carbs for 30 days, and these programs never work. Why? Because for the same reason that the digital detox. I mean, this is what a lot of books profess today around when it comes to technology. Do a digital detox, stop using social media, whatever it might be. And when that happens, it fails for the same reason, because when I would do these 30-day diets and say, okay, I'm going to lose a bunch of weight in 30 days, no carbs, no fat, whatever it might be for 30 days. Guess what happened on day 31, right? I would make up for lost time and I would eat everything because I hadn't gotten to the root cause of why I was eating things against my better interest, why I was doing things that were harming myself. And the same goes when it comes to distraction. Just getting it out of your life is not the solution. We need these technologies. We need email. We need social media. We use these things for our livelihood these days. These tools are wonderful. I'm sick of the advice of professors who just say, well, stop using it, and they don't have social media accounts themselves. That's easy to say. It's harder to actually do. And I don't think we have to actually do it. What we have to do is to learn how to use these tools in a way that serves us as opposed to us serving the tool.
So I'm going to come to you on that one a little later. I have some questions for you basis that. But an interesting question emerged the other day when discussing your book with Ambarish Gupta, the founder of Basis Vectors, and I guess he's on this call. And a question on his mind was that psychology classifies people into 16 types. And my psychologist tells me that apparently I am an INTJ. Now, on looking at this word cloud that we just displayed on screen a few minutes ago, what occurs to you as someone who pores over big data, has been an entrepreneur, and is now a writer? Do you think it is possible to classify people into silos of various kinds who are vulnerable to distractions? And what do you think we need to be aware of as people?
Yeah. So when it comes to classifications, there's only one widely accepted rubric for classifying personality types, and that's the big five: the ocean: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, neuroticism. Those are the big five. What you've mentioned is the Myers-Briggs. It's actually very bad. The Myers-Briggs is not scientifically sound. It's nice for kind of pop psychology, but it's really not
I'm going to ask for a refund
science.
from my psychologist for that.
You should. The Myers-Briggs is not very good. Right. There's a lot on the internet. If you Google Myers-Briggs effectiveness or science behind Myers-Briggs, you'll see that it's unfortunately a lot of hocus pocus. But there is the big five, the big five psychology traits. Exactly. Thank you for putting up the link. That we do see tends to be rather stable over one's life. If you're the kind of person who has greater extroversion versus introversion, conscientiousness, neuroticism, these five big traits tend to last over time. Although there's some more recent evidence that they also change throughout our life. So I think the big lesson here is to ask ourselves, with any label that we give ourselves, any label, to ask ourselves whether that label is really serving us. Because it's our choice whether we can subscribe to that label. You can believe you're an INTJ or not. You don't have to believe you're that thing, just as you don't have to believe that you have some kind of defined identity as a Muslim or a Christian or
Right.
a vegetarian. You can change your mind about who you are. And so these things can be decisions in that not so much to do. I do think that the science has shown that there are some personality traits that are harder to shake. However, you don't have to let those decisions define who you are, because sometimes they don't serve you. Let me give you a great example. In
Mm-hmm.
the book, I talk about this bit of pop psychology that many people believe in,
Mm-hmm.
which is that willpower is a finite resource, that
Yes.
we run out of willpower. And the
Yes.
way this looks is, excuse me, the way this looks, I would come home from work every day and I would say to myself, oh, I'm spent. I have nothing left. Gosh, I can't make any more good decisions. I'm out of willpower. Give me that ice cream. I'm going to sit on the couch and watch TV for an hour, right? Because I have no willpower left. And in fact, there was some research that found that this was real, that this idea that psychologists called ego depletion was promoted by one particular psychologist. And he did a lot of studies that showed that, willpower does decrease like gas in a gas tank.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounded too good to be true. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, it was, because what we do in the sciences, when a study sounds fishy, we replicate the study. We try and run it again. And many psychologists did this, and they found that in fact, it couldn't replicate, that
Right.
there is no such thing as ego depletion, that we do not run out of willpower like we run out of gas in a gas tank, except in one group of people. Carol Dweck, if you know the book Mindset, she's a
Yeah.
brilliant researcher at Stanford. She did these studies that found that, in fact, some people do exhibit ego depletion, that some people really do run out of willpower like they would run out of gas in a gas tank. And those people, and only those people, were people who believed that willpower was a finite resource.
Mm-hmm.
So if you believe that you were running out of willpower, it became true. Whereas if you didn't believe that, it wasn't true. And so this is a really important finding, because it tells us about the power and sometimes the adverse effects of a self-limiting belief.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really a big part of what I want to fight against when it comes to this book, because I think what we hear in the narrative these days, perpetuated by the media,
Mm-hmm.
is that technology is addicting everyone, that it's hijacking your brain, that it's telling you what to do. And in fact, that narrative is toxic. One, it's not scientifically true.
Mm-hmm.
Technology is not addicting everyone. Clearly, all kinds of things can be addictive to some people and not addict everyone. Many people have a glass of wine with dinner. We're not all alcoholics, right? Not everyone who plays poker once in a while is a problem gambler. So clearly, some things that are addictive to some people are not addictive to everyone. Some people do get addicted to technology. Not everyone does. But by everyone believing we are becoming addicted to technology, that it's hijacking our brains, it actually, ironically, becomes true. It leads to what's called learned helplessness, where we say, oh, our
Right.
kids, they can't stop playing video games because the video games are addictive. I can't stop checking email. What am I going to do? The algorithms got me, right? And
Right.
in fact, it becomes true. And so that's why I wrote this book, is to empower people to understand that they are much more powerful than they believe.
Right. Right. That is very, very insightful what you just offered, and I want to dig a little deeper into what you just articulated, and this is around motivation. But before we do that, let's get a sense from everyone in the room um, about. Let's run a poll and see, where does everyone in this room stand on their motivations? Why do you want to reduce distractions? Anmol, can we have this up on screen? And I think so. Folks, can you pick your choices? And I think Nir has some very, very interesting hypotheses here that I'd really like to listen to. So there we go, Nir. What we can see is that it's pretty 50-50 split. Uh, People want to increase productivity and to be present in the moment, and no one says that they're really distracted.
Yeah, that's interesting.
That's
No
interesting.
one doesn't have this problem.
No one has this problem. So
Yeah.
here's the so there is the question. Here's the question here.
Yeah.
Now, these are the reasons that we've seen that motivating people in the room to work towards a distraction-free environment. But if I read you right, your point is we are distracted because of emotional conflicts within ourselves. And this sounds most intriguing to me. Uh, are you insinuating then that people prone to distractions are emotionally vulnerable creatures? Um,
Well, I think we're all emotionally vulnerable creatures. That all of us have these sensations.
the reason I said that, because when I read that, that sounded like a very harsh assessment, quite honestly, of myself.
Mm.
And in your book, you put this down to internal triggers, and that we must master these internal triggers. Can you help us understand
Sure.
this better, ideally with some personal and professional examples?
Yeah, let's talk about first what we mean by distraction. We should probably define it so we
Sure,
all get on the same page in terms of what we mean here.
sounds good.
So the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So the opposite of distraction is not focus. Most people will tell you the opposite of distraction is focus. I don't agree. The opposite of distraction is not focus, it is traction. That if you look at the etymology of the word, in fact, traction and distraction both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And they both end in the same 6-letter word, ACTION, that spells action. So traction is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do, things that you are doing with intent. The opposite of traction is distraction, anything you do that pulls you away from what you plan to do. So this is really important for 2 reasons. Number one, anything can be a distraction. I used to, before I learned this methodology, I would sit down at my desk and I would say, okay, now I'm going to work on that big project. Now I'm going to do the thing that I've been delaying, the thing that I've been procrastinating. Here I go. I'm finally going to work on that big thing. I'm going to get to work. I'm going to get started. Here I go. But first, let me check email. Right? How many times has that happened to us? Why? Because we think, well, email is kind of a worky thing to do. Email is something I have to do anyway. That's a productive task, right? Well, if it's not what you plan to do with your time, it is just as much of a distraction. If you're watching YouTube videos or playing a video game, that's an obvious distraction, right? If you're doing that at work. But I would argue that also checking email when you plan to work on that big project, when you plan to do that thing that you really wanted to do, but now you're doing something else, that is just as much of a distraction, if not more so, because now distraction has tricked you into prioritizing the urgent at the expense of the important. And that is toxic for our productivity. If we are constantly reacting all day long, we have no time to do the really important stuff that requires long-term diligent effort. So anything can be a distraction, and conversely, anything can be traction. So I argue that we should stop this silly moral hierarchy of, oh, some technologies are bad for you, right? That playing video games is somehow evil, or using social media is rotting your brain. Ridiculous, right? There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing morally superior to watching cricket over playing a video game. It's all entertainment. It's all pastime, and there's nothing wrong with it as long as you do it on your schedule according to your values, not based on someone else's schedule and someone else's values. So as long as you plan time for it in your day, there's nothing wrong with any of these technologies. It's when we use them for the wrong reasons. So what are the wrong reasons? Let's get to that. Why do we do these actions that lead us towards traction or distraction? What's the root of why we do what we do? So Plato asked this question 2,500 years ago, 2,500 years before the cell phone. Plato asked, why do we get distracted, right? The world was distracting even 2,500 years ago before these technologies. And so we have to, in order to answer Plato's question of why do we get distracted, we have to go a layer deeper to ask ourselves, why do we do anything? What is the seat of human motivation? Now, most people, if you ask them what drives us, what motivates people, they'll tell you some version of carrots and sticks, that it's all about the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. This is called Freud's pleasure principle. Unfortunately, it's not true. It's not how it works. That neurologically in the brain, the reason we do everything is not because of the pursuit of pleasure and the avoidance of pain. Everything we do for one reason. And that one reason is to avoid discomfort. It's pain all the way down. Everything we do, even the pursuit of pleasurable sensations, wanting, craving, desire, lusting. There's a reason we say love hurts, because neurologically, that is exactly what is happening in the brain. In fact, in the brain, there are two neural circuits. One is called the liking system. One is called the wanting system, two separate circuits. The liking system encodes memories of pleasure so that the wanting system goads us with discomfort to get us to go get that pleasurable sensation, because the brain doesn't do what feels good. The brain does what felt good. And so the way the brain gets us to act is by helping us escape discomfort. For example, think about this physiologically. If you go outside and it's cold, you put on a coat because being cold doesn't feel comfortable. If you go back inside, now it's too hot, you take your coat off. If you're hungry, you feel hunger pangs, so you eat. And if you eat too much, oh, now you feel stuffed, that doesn't feel good, you stop eating.
Right.
This is called the homeostatic response. And so this is how we regulate our bodies. And it turns out the same exact thing holds true for our psychological sensations. So when you're feeling lonely, you check Facebook or WhatsApp. When you're uncertain, you Google. When you're feeling bored, you check sports scores, the news, Reddit, Pinterest, doesn't matter. You use these products and services to make you feel better. And so that's why this is so important, because if we agree that all human behavior is prompted by a desire to escape discomfort, what this means, therefore, is that time management is pain management. It doesn't matter what kind of life hacks or gurus techniques you might use to help you be more productive. Fundamentally, if we don't deal with this fact that the reason we get distracted, the reason we do everything is to escape discomfort and learn tools to deal with that discomfort in a healthier manner, we will always get distracted by something. So this is the reason we don't exercise when we say we will. This is the reason we don't eat right when we say we will. This is the reason we don't do that task we say we're going to do at work, because we are looking to escape discomfort and we don't have the tools to deal with that discomfort in a way that leads towards traction rather than distraction.
Sounds very interesting. Nir, I'm going to interrupt you here. I'm just going to pardon. There's a very interesting question that is coming from Atul Sethi. He wants to ask you, my mind chattering is my largest source of distraction, way ahead of digital too. Any
Absolutely.
thoughts of how to be aware about this and then manage this?
Yeah. So this is the first step. So just to be clear, in the book, there's a 4-part model. So the first step is to master the internal triggers. That's where we start. The second step is to make time for traction. We can talk about that as well. Then we have to hack back the external triggers, all the external triggers, the pings, dings, and rings, all of these things in our environment that can lead to distraction. And then the fourth and final step is to prevent distraction with pacts. So let's go into depth into that first step, but I want people to know that there are 4 steps that we can use in concert. This is what took me 5 years of research, is to understand the 4 fundamental steps that when we do together, this is how we become indistractable. So there's no one magic bullet. There's no one technique, boom, just do this. No, you have to do all 4. And when you use all 4 techniques, this is how we overcome distraction. But the first and most important step, if we don't get right, we will always become distracted, is to master these internal triggers. And you're exactly right that most distraction, in fact, does come from within. When we look at time studies, it's not the pings, dings, and rings. That's what we tend to blame. We tend to blame these things in our environment that lead us towards distraction. But most distraction, in fact, does start from within. Boredom, loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty. This is why we are looking for escape. If you can't sit in a meeting for an hour without taking out email, guess what? It's not the email. It's something going on inside of us. It's uncertainty, it's stress, it's something that we don't know how to deal with in a way that leads to healthy outcomes, leads to traction over distraction. So there's 3 big techniques that we can use that I just talk about in the book. The first is to reimagine the trigger. The second is to reimagine the task. And the third is to reimagine our temperament. We actually talked about the temperament piece already when I talked about ego depletion, about how we need to rid ourselves of these unhelpful self-images that can actually lead to the behaviors we actually don't want. So that's what reimagining the temperament is all about. Reimagining the task is all about how we can learn to make the behavior we don't want to do, the thing that we are procrastinating from, the thing that we are trying to avoid, less painful. And the way we can do that is by learning to play the task. Now, this is interesting because, you know, the conventional wisdom out there, the folk psychology is, well, make it more rewarding, right? If a task sucks, if people don't want to do something, well, just give them more money or give them more reward, or say to myself, oh, if I do this thing that's not fun, well, then I'll reward myself with an ice cream at the end or something. And this is the Mary Poppins method, right? The Mary Poppins method of putting a spoonful of sugar on something. And it turns out that this actually backfires. That when we have what's called extrinsic motivations, our creativity declines. We're much less likely to do that task in the future unless we get as much reward. And so it habituates us to always expect the same reward, which may not always come. So what psychologists tell us instead to do is to learn how to play the activity. How do we do that? Well, we have to start by realizing that play doesn't have to be enjoyable. Play doesn't have to be fun. Play just has to occupy our attention long enough to let us get through that task. So how do we do that? 2 ways. 1, we focus more intensely on the task. And 2, we look for the variability. And so I describe exactly how to do this in the book, but the examples of how this can be done, you know, think about all the things that somebody in your life does with enjoyment, something that occupies them, and you think is horribly boring, right? I have a friend who loves cars. He's a car buff. And he works on his car all the time in his spare time. I mean, you'd have to pay me to work on a car, right? I don't want to be a mechanic, but he really enjoys it because he focuses more intensely on it and he looks for the variability. I have another friend who's a coffee aficionado and he loves everything about coffee. I love coffee. I like to drink coffee, but you'd have to pay me to be a barista. I'm not going to do that for free. And he does it with joy. Why? Because he focuses more intensely on the task and looks for the variability. And it turns out we can turn all sorts of things that are otherwise mundane into play by using these 2 techniques. And I describe exactly how to do that. The final technique that I want to talk about real quick is about how to reimagine the triggers. How do we see this discomfort differently? And the first thing to realize is that, you know, there's a lot of misinformation out there from the self-help productivity community around happiness. That we are told, many people profess, that if you're not happy all the time, if you're not satisfied with your life all the time, that something's wrong with you, that's something to be fixed. And I argue that that is not true. I mean, think about it from an evolutionary basis. Our species is designed, we have evolved with this perpetual disquietude. We are evolved to not be happy for long. Happiness is meant to be a fleeting sensation. So, you know, think about it from an evolutionary basis. If there was ever a group of Homo sapiens who were always happy all the time and satisfied and never wanted for anything, those people were probably killed and eaten by our ancestors, right? Because that would not be a beneficial evolutionary trait. You want a species to always be striving and craving and wanting and inventing, right? And so we need to start by understanding that feeling bad is not bad. It's okay to feel bad. That's what drives you to get better. And so number 1, we reimagine that internal trigger as something that can actually benefit us, that can lead us towards traction rather than distraction. Now, there's a bunch of techniques I talk about in the book. And all these techniques, by the way, this isn't my personal philosophy. There are about 20 pages of citations. Everything is backed by peer-reviewed studies. And so one of the techniques I describe in the book comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. And this is called the 10-minute rule. The 10-minute rule can be very, very effective. Here's how it works. When we find ourselves about to get distracted, whether that distraction is eating that piece of chocolate cake that we know we don't really need, or whether it's not going to exercise when we say we would, or checking email when we said we would work on a big project. What you want to do is to tell yourself that you can give in to that distraction. You can do that thing that you said you wouldn't do in just 10 minutes. Now, why is this so effective as opposed to telling yourself a hard no, right? We call this strict abstinence. Strict abstinence is when you tell yourself, no, absolutely not. I'm not going to do that thing. Well, it turns out that with many things, sometimes strict abstinence can work, but with things that are hard to avoid altogether, right? If you're on a diet, you can't stop eating. If you work, you can't stop using technology. You need these technologies. You can't just abstain from them. And in fact, when we try to abstain from them, here's what happens. It's kind of like a rubber band. When you pull a rubber band, you pull on a rubber band. Eventually, you can't pull anymore, and it has to go free. You have to let go of it. The rubber band doesn't just stop where it started. No, it goes even further, right? It ricochets farther. Why does it do that? Well, because this is very similar to what happens when we tell ourselves not to do something. For example, if I say right now, do not think about a white bear. Whatever you do, don't think about a white bear. What are you thinking about? Of course, you can't think of nothing but a white bear. So when we tell ourselves, don't do it, 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 okay, fine. When we relieve ourselves and do the thing we told ourselves not to do, the brain actually registers this as pleasure, because the relief of that discomfort itself is motivating. Remember what we said earlier, all human behavior is prompted by a desire to escape discomfort. So strict abstinence doesn't work for many things. What does work is this 10-minute rule, where we tell ourselves, okay, I can give in to this temptation in just 10 minutes. Now, what do you do for those 10 minutes? You have two choices. You can either get back to the task at hand, do the thing that you were getting distracted from, or explore that sensation, that feeling of why you got distracted, that internal trigger, with curiosity rather than contempt. Okay? Most people, when it comes to distraction, they fall into two categories. We have what's called the blamers and the shamers. The blamers, they say, oh, it's the technology that did it to me. It's this evil product that did it to me. It's the chocolate cake that did it to me. It's the alcohol that did it to me. Those are the blamers. Then we have the shamers. The shamers, and this is the category I used to fall into, the shamers tell themselves, oh, I must be dysfunctional somehow. Maybe I'm an imposter. Maybe I'm no good at this job. Maybe I'm lazy. Maybe there's something wrong with me. And we shame ourselves, which ironically makes the problem even worse. Why? Because the worse we feel, the more likely we are to look for a distraction to take our mind off of these bad feelings. So shaming doesn't work either. What you want to do is to be a claimer. A claimer is not a blamer, not a shamer, but a claimer. A claimer claims responsibility for their reaction to their discomfort. You can't change how you feel. Okay, you have no control over what comes into your head. What you can control is how you react to those feelings. That's all you can control. So a claimer claims responsibility, acknowledging, look, this isn't your fault. You didn't invent social media. You didn't invent email. You didn't invent the iPhone. You didn't invent that piece of chocolate cake. That's not your fault, but it is your responsibility. And so a claimer claims responsibility and says, how can I react to that discomfort in a healthier manner? So when you feel that discomfort, when you feel that internal trigger, as opposed to just impulsively reaching for something to take your mind off of your pain, we sit with that sensation and we explore it with curiosity rather than contempt. And if you do that for just 10 minutes, you will do what psychologists call surf the urge. Because it turns out that emotions, with the research around emotions shows that emotions are like waves. They crest and they subside. So we want to surf the urge, kind of like a surfer on a surfboard, until it subsides. And it turns out that 9 times out of 10, if you just tell yourself 10 minutes and then I can give into that distraction, what you're doing is you will find that by the end of those 10 minutes, you're already back on that task at hand. And you're building up this ability, this confidence in yourself that, look, I can actually overcome my distractions. I don't have to impulsively reach for something to take my mind off of these uncomfortable emotional states. And you start becoming more likely to get back to the task at hand.
So while on this theme, I suspect boredom can creep into intimate relationships as well. And if I were to just stay, if you were to just stay on that, that is why I found that part where you suggest that everybody create your own playground, a very interesting one. Um, and I guess that can probably expand into various domains. Now, two questions here. What does your playground look like? Um, I, the point you made about it took you 5 years to write this book because you were distracted.
That's
And
right. Yeah.
and second, when you look around, uh, whose playgrounds do you find most inspiring?
Well, I'll answer the second one first. I think
Sure, sure,
it's really about, you know, what can you learn to play for yourself based on
sure.
what activities you find difficult. So there's in the literature there's this idea of flow. There's a psychologist by the name of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi who talks about this amazing state of flow. That if you can get into the psychological state of flow, then time goes by quickly. You enjoy the task more, and it's a wonderful place to be. The problem is it's really hard to get there for things you don't like to do, right? So in his work he talks about how amazing basketball players get into flow, and artists can get into flow because they like what they're doing. It's really hard to do for something you don't enjoy doing, right? Nobody gets into flow over doing accounting or whatever or most people don't, maybe some people do. And so I love the concept of flow, but it really doesn't tend to work for things that people don't like doing, that have a lot of internal triggers, the kind of stuff that people tend to procrastinate from. And so, you know, whether that's email, if you're looking at your email inbox and you've got 100 messages, you know, nobody's getting into flow when they're dreading doing email. So that technique doesn't work. What you can do, however, is learn to play that task. So in my case, you asked what are my playgrounds? You know, I've written 2 books now, and writing never comes easy. It is hard work. And I'm constantly tempted to be distracted, right? I'll say to myself, you know what, maybe I should just do a bit of research. I bet there's something in one of these books I should read. Or maybe I'll just Google this one thing. Or let me just look this up real quick. And of course, if I go down that path, then I'll waste, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe an hour doing something I really didn't need to do. What I needed to do was to focus and write and think. And so that process is never easy. And so what I tend to do is to make some kind of playground by following these 2 rules of, number one, focusing more intensely on the task, right? So how does that look? So there's a wonderful quote that goes that the cure for boredom is curiosity. There's no cure for curiosity. So what guides me is the curiosity of finding the answer to the problem I'm working on, right? That's what's inspiring to me as a writer. And when things do get tough, that's what I reset into. You know, what's the mystery? What's the uncertainty? What's the thing I don't know that I'm trying to uncover for myself? So that's part of how I make this playground. And then you can add in all kinds of other forms of variability, right? You know, how can you change the turn of phrase? How can you complete the task most efficiently? All kinds of things that you can do to add variability to that playground.
Sure. I can see there are a truckload of questions which are coming in. There are questions coming in furiously. I'm just going to hold those questions for a bit because what I want to do is I just want to deal with the work part as well. And so I'm going to just run a quick poll first. Anmol, can you help us with this poll so that this poll is about what do you think are the best ways to reduce distractions? And time permitting, we're going to come back to these questions and we're going to take up Nir on all of these questions. I can see they're choking my screen there.
Good.
I must admit that, well, I'm not going to bias anyone actually. Okay. There we go. Create. So there we go, Nir. We see a range of responses.
Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting actually. So this is good because None of the above is tied with create to-do list. and, and managing time. I think, managing time is not the solution. That's the problem. How do we manage our
Yes,
time? So it's, it's easy
exactly.
to say. It's not a tactic. It's a strategy. Um, which is interesting. So there's a lot here. We talked about the first step of how to become indistractable, which is to master the internal triggers. I think it's important, because the two poll responses were around to-do lists and managing time. Let's move on to the second step, if it's okay with you, to talk
Sure.
about how to make time for traction. So remember earlier we talked about how traction is anything we do with intent, things that pull us towards what we really want to do. The opposite
Yeah.
is distraction.
Yes.
So the second step to becoming indistractable is to make time for traction. How do we do that?
How do we do that?
So the way we do this is that we turn our values into time. What are values? Values are the attributes of the person you want to become. Let me say that again. Values are the attributes of the person you want to become. So
So
when I ask you to do it,
if I may
yeah.
interrupt you there, Nir, if I hear you right, that also translates into that GTD lists are not the way to go, but values, you translate values into GTD lists are translated into values lists. Is that
Well,
what the insinuation is out here?
so to-do lists on their own
Hmm.
don't work.
Right.
Fail. I
Right.
hate to-do lists on their own.
Right.
To-do lists as part of a bigger strategy actually does work. And I'm going to show you exactly how to use that. I know lots of people, this is what I used to do. I
Hmm.
would make to-do lists and I'd have 100 things to do on my to-do list. And I'd have a really productive day. I'd get through 15 things today. And
Hmm.
then at the end of the day, I'd look at my to-do list and I still have 85 things to do.
Right.
And every day I felt like a loser because I didn't get done what I said I would get, what I would do. I would say, I promise to do these things. That's what a to-do list is. A to-do list is a promise of the output for the day. And day after day, I would recycle, most of the things on my to-do list from one day to the next to the next. And let's be honest, everybody with a to-do list has done this. And what you're doing is reinforcing in your brain, you're a loser. You can't get done what you said you're going to get done. And you reinforce it and you make it acceptable. It's not acceptable. What we want to do instead of a to-do list is to plan the input, not the output. Think about how ridiculous this is. Let's say you go to a baker and you go to the baker and you said, I need 100 loaves of bread. The baker would say, okay, 100 loaves of bread coming right up. Now, where's the flour? Where's the sugar? Where's the yeast? Where's the salt? I need the input to give you the output, right? But when it comes to knowledge workers, somehow we just think if we write things on a to-do list, it'll magically get done. No, that's not true. To plan the output, you have to control the input. Well, what's our input? As knowledge workers, it's one thing, time. So instead of saying, here's what I want to finish this, finish that. That's what most people's to-do lists look like. Finish task A, task B, task C. We are, by the way, hundreds of studies have found, and we know this to be practically true, that we are terrible at predicting how long a task is going to take us to complete. People are awful at this. So instead of planning the output, in which case most of the time you don't know when you'll do it, so you won't get it done. Instead of planning the output, in which case you're reinforcing being a loser every day, instead what you want to do is the only goal should be to work on a task for a set period of time without distraction. That's it. That should be what is on your calendar, is work on this task 30 minutes, 45 minutes, an hour, however long you want to work on it without distraction. Why? Because when you finish that block of time, you're an instant winner. It doesn't matter if you finish the task. All that matters is you did what you said you were going to do. You worked on this task without distraction for that given period of time. And of course, the net result of working on a task diligently without distraction is the output. That's how you get it done. And so what we want to do, what I found, I interviewed thousands of people over the past 5 years. I interviewed a bunch of people who were very productive, didn't struggle with distraction. I interviewed a lot of people who did struggle with distraction. And a common defining trait between these two groups was that the people who were productive, the people who lived with personal integrity and did what they said they were going to do every day, they kept time-boxed calendars. And people who felt overwhelmed, that they were constantly distracted, that, the social media this and the boss wants that and the kids want this and they can't get things done, when I asked them to see their calendars, there was tons of white space in their day, lots of unscheduled time. Well, here's the thing. Remember this. You cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it distracted you from. So if you have white space in your day, everything is a distraction. You didn't define what you want to do with your time. And of course, if you don't schedule your day, somebody else will. So this is where it comes down to turning your values into time, not into tasks, into time. Meaning, if, I talk about in the book these 3 life domains, you are at the center. So if physical health is important to you, maybe it's not important to you. I'm not saying it should be your value, whatever your values are. But if physical health is one of your values, do you just talk about it? Or do you have time in your day to exercise, to get proper nutrition, to go to bed on time? Is that in your calendar? If one of your values is about the personal relationships, having close friendships, having good relationships with your children, your spouse, if that's important to you, if that's one of your values, do you leave it for last? Do you leave it for whatever scraps of time is what you give your spouse or your kids or your family members? Or do you make time for them in your schedule? And then finally, work. And this is where most people start, but of course it should be the opposite way around. In the work domain, I give many presentations, and oftentimes I'll ask a group of 200 people in a workshop, and I'll say, how many of you need to think for your job? How many of you need time for reflection and thought in your job? Every hand goes up in the room. And then I ask, how many of you have on your calendar time for that reflection and thought? Maybe 1 or 2 hands go up. So time to think. If you want a competitive advantage over your colleagues, over your competitors, make time to think in your day. If you just react all day long to emails and messages, you have no time for reflection. And so that time needs to be built into your calendar as well. So that's why we need what's called a time box calendar. And I'll give you a link that we can share here, or maybe someone can look it up on my website. I have a tool called a schedule maker tool that allows you to plan a time box schedule for your week. And so what I want you to do, don't worry about these 5-year goals or the vision boards. No, let's just start with next week, okay? How would you live next week according to your values? Not when you retire, but in your current life, how much time would you allocate for the things that are important to you? Right? And include the mundane stuff, include time for traffic, include time for meals, include that stuff too, because that has to take time in your day. And then see how much time is left for all the other values that you have in your life. So thank you very much. Ramnath posted the link in the chat here for the schedule maker tool. It's totally free. Anyone can use it. It's basically a template to make your ideal week. Now, why is this so important? Because the idea here is not to be very rigid and say, oh, I'm never going to change this schedule. No. You want to revise this schedule as an experiment every week. I want you to think in your head, every week is an experiment. And your job is to make that weekly schedule to fill up every minute of your day and then revise it in the following week based on your obligations, right? If you have a meeting here, an appointment there, whatever, you can change those things, but to adjust your calendar accordingly from week to week to make sure you turn your values into time and make the calendar easier to follow in the week ahead. So that for every minute of the day, you can look at the calendar and say, oh, what's on my calendar, that's traction. Anything else is a distraction. That's why a time box calendar is so valuable.
Thanks so much for that. Now, we have a skeptic in the room, and on whose behalf I must ask this question. I can't name him for obvious reasons. He's based out of Bangalore, works for a tech multinational, and his bosses insist he must be always on, and his team is spread across time zones. He swears by GTD lists, and I know of him as a pragmatic, super efficient man. His question is, when you are accountable to a demanding board and your job is on the nice, all this sounds nice to know, but isn't effective. What do you think is he missing, and what piece of advice may you offer him?
Yeah, so not the first time I've heard this reaction, and I would say, look, if you work in a call center, your job is to be reactive all day. Okay, you sit by the phone, and if the phone rings, you pick up the call and you react to it. Fine. You don't need to plan every minute of your day. You just have a huge block of time from 9 to 5 or whenever it is that your working hours are. You are reactive all day long. I'm guessing most people who are listening to this video right now, they're not working in call centers. Your job requires some element of thinking, some element of reflection, not just reacting. And so for that amount of time, you have to book that time just like you would book a meeting with an important person, because you are that important person. And so if you say, look, I need to be available and reactive for 6 hours out of my day, that's fine. But make sure you are also making time for the other things that are important for your job. If you don't have that time to think, you're just reacting all day long, right? And my guess is that the person who asked this question also has that time scheduled, or else how is he getting all those tasks done? Well, the advice here is to protect that time. Protect the time, if it's whether it's to go exercise, to protect your sleep, to whatever it might be. It's important to do that. Now, how do we do that when we have a boss, right? If we have a boss that calls us at 8 p.m. when we're with our family eating dinner, it doesn't matter what we've planned. If we don't pick up the call, we'll get fired, right? By the way, this is good evidence that it's not the technology, right? We don't blame the phone for the boss calling us. We blame the kind of culture and work environment that makes that okay to do, right? There's a whole section in the book about how to build an indistractable workplace, where I argue that the cause of distraction in the workplace is cultural dysfunction. So there's a whole chapter on that as well. But the idea here, the one step we didn't discuss when it comes to making time for traction, is we want to do what's called a schedule sync. A schedule sync is when we sit down with the stakeholders in our life, whether it's at home, whether it's in the workplace, and we show our boss, we show them, look, here's my calendar for the week. This takes 10 minutes. Your boss will worship the ground you walk on, because now they have transparency into how you spend your time. So if you just show your manager, your boss, look, here's how I spend my time. Here's all the priorities I have for the day. Here's the stuff I won't get to because, look, there's no time for it. Help me swap out what you'd like me to change. Help me reprioritize. Why is this so important? We all know that we have to say no more often, right? That in order to stay focused, we have to say no to things because we'll just get inundated. The problem is, how do you say no to your boss? You can't. Here's what you do instead. You show them the calendar and you say, here's what I'm doing. Okay, here's my priorities for the week. If there's anything that's missing, help me reprioritize. So now it's your boss that's helping you say no. Now, if you are the boss, you can institute this with your colleagues. How many managers, how many of us are desperate to know what the heck our workers are doing every day? They seem busy, but what are they working on? Let me tell you, I guarantee you that at least a quarter of how your workers are spending their time are on the wrong priorities, and you don't even know. And so by making this a practice of a weekly schedule sync with your direct reports, and then your direct reports do this with their direct reports, now you have visibility into, here's how I plan my day, here's what I will be doing, here's what I will not be doing. This is how we do this schedule sync process, and it is revolutionary. It will change your productivity, your sense of well-being, and your happiness when it comes to your work-life balance.
Hey, thanks so much for that, Nir. Because you preempted a question that I was going to ask you about how do you deal with a toxic work environment and toxic bosses, and I also saw that you just put out a piece on that yesterday. Am I right about that?
Yeah, that's right. I just published that on my blog, right?
And there's a question that has just come in from G. Venkatraman, and I must just ask you that very quickly. Does the 10-minute idea mean that you have short-term goals instead of having impossible goals, and that gives into temptation sooner or later?
I'm not sure if I understand the short-term versus long-term goals part.
Does the 10-minute idea mean having short-term goals instead of having impossible goals?
Impossible goals.
Yeah.
Well, I think the idea of, if you time box your day, if you plan to work on that task without distraction for a given period of time, this is how we accomplish these long-term goals, right? We'll never accomplish the long-term goals if we don't do the work today to start working towards the future. I think this is why most people tend to do the short-term urgent things as opposed to the long-term important things. It feels good to check email. It feels like we're being productive. But of course, that's just reactionary work. That's not reflective work. That doesn't bring us towards the long-term goals of where we're trying to accomplish. It needs to be part of our day, clearly. And I talk about in the third step of how to hack back external triggers, how we can hack back email. It has to be part of our day. Clearly, we need to use it. What I don't want people to do is to constantly react to these things to make themselves feel like they're productive, when really what they should be working on is the longer term, more difficult stuff that requires focus, that requires us to concentrate on just one task at a time.
Nir, you've covered a lot of ground, and
Oh, we're
I'm
just
gonna.
halfway through. Not
I
even.
know, I know. But you only offered, you only promised me 1 hour of your time, and I know how closely you tightly you sandbox your time. So I'm going to ask you one question about
Uh-huh.
you personally. Uh, what is your creative process like? You have often spoken about how most of the books you read on being less distracted had all the wrong insights and they didn't
Mm,
help you. And a few people I spoke to say that they received it well and it's helping them. Can you walk us through your thought process?
yeah.
How did you arrive at the insights you have arrived at? Did you think it alone? Was it through observing people,
Yeah.
trial and error? What was it? Can you
Yeah.
take us as deeply as you can through your journey?
Sure. And by the way, I'm not saying that all productivity books are wrong. I think that some concepts, particularly this concept that technology is the problem, is wrong. That I don't agree with. That I think technology can very much be the solution to the problem. And in fact, it obfuscates the real problem. But look, if GTD or these other techniques are working for you, wonderful, keep doing it. I want to talk to the people who, despite using some of these techniques, still struggle with distraction. That's me, right? I read all the productivity books and I was still not getting done what I said I would get done. And so that's why I embarked on this 5-year quest to figure out why I kept getting distracted despite using some of these techniques. And so that's really who I'm speaking to, is the person who, still doesn't get done what they said they would get done. They're still not in the best shape. They're still not spending the kind of quality time they want with their family. They're still not getting done what they said they would get done at work. That's the kind of person who I definitely was, and that's changed. I'm in the best shape of my life physically. I have a better relationship with my wife than ever. We've been married for 18 years. I spend more quality time with my child, and I'm more productive than ever before because I use these 4 techniques. And the way I came across this, by the way, and I think as opposed to some other personal development books where it's, I take a shower at 4 a.m. and in freezing water and it works for me, you should do the same, right? Or here is the perfect morning routine. Everyone should do it because it works for me. That doesn't hold water for me. Everything in my book is backed by peer-reviewed studies. There's 20 pages of citations. Everything is backed by 30, 40-year-old research. What was important for me, however, was to have this picture, right? Is to have this model that explains the strategy. Tactics are what you do. Strategy is why you do it. So the most important thing here is not, oh, use this app on your phone or this email service provider or whatever. That's tactics. That's easy stuff. What took me 5 years was the picture, the model of traction, distraction, external triggers, and internal triggers. Once you understand those 4 steps, those 4 important factors to becoming indistractable, now you can systematically adopt techniques in all 4, but you have to first understand the strategy. So that's what actually took me the most amount of time, was sorting through the mounds of research out there, sifting through the stuff that doesn't work or doesn't matter, and then making sure we put these in the right order. So, as I mentioned, if you use some of these tactics, like if you use to-do lists before you have tactics to master the internal triggers, the to-do lists aren't going to work, because you'll have a to-do list and you just won't do it. And we've all done this, right? Because if you don't have the tools to master the internal triggers, we have to face this fact that this is why we get distracted. You need those tools first before those other techniques will become effective. So, there's other things we didn't get a chance to talk about around how do you hack back the external triggers? How do you hack back email? How do you hack back meetings? Oh my God, how much time do we spend in stupid, superfluous meetings? Well, I teach you exactly how to hack those back. How do we hack back group chat or the open floor plan office? It turns out the number 1 source of distraction in the workplace is other people. How do we hack that back? I tell you exactly how to do that. And then the 4th step, which has to come last, is about preventing distraction with pact. where I show you exactly how you can make these contracts, these pre-commitments with yourself and with other people to make sure that you don't get distracted in the future.
So there's a question which has actually come in from Vivek Kelkar here. If you could, the point you made about traction, can you spend a little bit more time on traction? Can you please, Neil, explain that bit on traction a little bit more? Do you have the bandwidth to do that?
I actually have to go because I do keep a time box calendar. So unfortunately, I do have to run here. But there's a lot, we touched on it a bit. There's a lot more, of course, in the book, Indistractable. If you go to indistractable.com, you'll actually get this. Well, actually, no, I already sent it to you. So you're kind enough to send out this 80-page workbook.
Yes.
That will help you step by step. Actually, I made it really easy for busy professionals to work through these questions in order to become indistractable. And if you do end up getting the book, if you go to indistractable.com, there's also a complimentary video course as well that you can have access to as well.
Well, Nir, I totally understand and appreciate the time you've taken out. So from examining motivations, lessons learned from other parts of the world, placing in perspective the difference between traction and distraction as opposed to focus, and taking us through your personal journey, you've covered a lot of ground. And
My pleasure.
What to ensure that everyone stays indistractable, we'll email everyone in this room the workbook that Nir has crafted. And we will certainly stay connected and take more questions in the weeks to come. And if Nir's sandboxed time permits, I hope he answers all of it. Nir, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you.